A racist cop pulls Snoop Dogg over on the road and demands he open the trunk. But what he finds inside turns the whole situation upside down. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. The city was asleep. The streets stretched out like veins, pulsing faintly with the glow of streetlights. Most of the windows in the modest houses lining the roads were dark, their inhabitants nestled in the comfort of routine slumber. It was the kind of night where time felt slower, the quiet pressing in like an invisible fog, but not for Snoop Dogg. Behind the wheel of his sleek black Cadillac Escalade, the hum of the engine vibrated through his fingertips. He gripped the wheel a little tighter than necessary. The leather interior, immaculate and polished, reflected the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Outside, the world blurred past in muted shades of gray and gold, each passing streetlight casting fleeting patterns across the windshield. The music, playing through the car's speakers, was his own, a beat from years ago, one that once filled arenas and clubs with energy. Now it seemed distant, like an echo from a different life. He kept the volume low, more out of habit than any real need for quiet. His focus wasn't on the music. It was on the ticking numbers of the digital clock mounted just above the dashboard. 10:43 p.m. He cursed under his breath, his foot pressing slightly harder on the gas. The tires whispered against the asphalt as the car picked up speed. He wasn't late yet, but time was tightening around him like a noose. "Man, I'm pushing it," he muttered, tapping the steering wheel anxiously. His phone, balanced precariously in the center console, lit up with an incoming call. Without taking his eyes off the road, he tapped the screen to answer. "You on your way?" a voice asked immediately, his manager Marcus. "I'm almost there," Snoop replied, though he knew almost wasn't entirely accurate. "Don't mess this up, man," Marcus said. "You know what this means. These people need that shipment tonight. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. You're their lifeline right now." Snoop exhaled through his nose, forcing calm into his voice. "I got it, Marcus. Relax." The shipment was stacked neatly in the trunk, boxes of medical supplies, clean water filters, and portable generators, all bound for a community center in the heart of the city. A recent storm had flooded the area, leaving dozens of families stranded and cut off from basic necessities. When Snoop heard about it earlier that day, he didn't hesitate. He wasn't the kind of man to sit back and watch while his people suffered. He'd filled the car himself, loading box after box with the kind of determination that left no room for second thoughts. Now, as the minutes slipped away, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just a delivery. It was a promise. "You're good?" Marcus asked, the sharpness in his tone fading just slightly. "I'm good," Snoop said. "Stay by your phone. I'll call when I get there." He hung up before Marcus could add anything else and refocused on the road. The Escalade purred beneath him, smooth and powerful. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, but the moment didn't last. The first flash of red and blue lights hit the rearview mirror like a slap. Snoop's eyes darted up, his pulse quickening. The cruiser was close, hugging his rear bumper like a predator stalking prey. Its siren wailed briefly, a sharp, commanding sound that sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Shit," he hissed, easing off the gas. His mind raced, calculating the possibilities. He wasn't speeding. Not really. 5, maybe 10 over the limit. Nothing that should have drawn attention, unless... He glanced down at himself. The gold chains resting against his chest, the tattoos peeking out from under his sleeve. He could already imagine the assumptions. His grip tightened on the wheel as he pulled toward the curb, the cruiser following closely. He rolled down the window, letting the cool night air seep into the car. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, boots heavy against the pavement. Even in the dim light, Snoop could see the stiffness in the man's shoulders, the way his hand lingered near his holster. No smiles. No casual approach. Snoop swallowed hard and rested both hands on the steering wheel. He'd been here before, too many times. The officer reached the driver's side window, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't speak at first, just let his eyes sweep over Snoop and the interior of the car. "License and registration," he said finally, his voice low and sharp. Snoop moved slowly, his fingers deliberate as he reached for the glove compartment. He'd learned the rules. No sudden movements, no back talk, no questions. Keep it simple. Keep it safe. The officer's flashlight flickered across the papers as Snoop handed them over. The beam lingered on his face for just a moment longer than necessary. "You in a hurry tonight?" the officer asked, though the tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Just trying to get somewhere," Snoop said, his voice steady. The officer's lips curled slightly, more sneer than smile. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Snoop froze. "Is there a problem, officer?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. "That wasn't a request," the officer replied, taking a small step back but keeping his hand near his holster. Snoop felt his stomach drop. He could hear Marcus's voice in his head, telling him to stay cool, to keep it together. But every muscle in his body tensed as he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to calm the heat rising under his skin. "Turn around. Hands on the car," the officer said. Snoop turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The street was empty. No witnesses. He placed his hands against the cold metal of the car and tried not to think about the boxes in the trunk. The officer's hands were rough as they patted him down, moving with the kind of aggression that spoke more of power than protocol. "You got anything I should know about?" "No, sir." "Drugs? Weapons?" "No, sir." The flashlight beam danced across the car's interior again, searching for something, anything, to justify the stop. And, as the seconds dragged into minutes, Snoop felt it, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It never was. And as the officer straightened up and gestured toward the trunk, Snoop knew this was far from over. The night felt heavier now. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, stretching across the pavement like silent witnesses. Snoop Dogg stood by his car, his hands pressed against the cool metal of the hood, the weight of the officer's gaze burning into his back. The officer's name tag read Ridge, but it might as well have said Predator. Everything about the man, his stiff posture, the way his hand never strayed too far from his holster, radiated a controlled hostility. Snoop inhaled slowly through his nose, forcing the tension in his chest to stay contained. He had learned this dance long ago, knew the steps by heart. Keep calm, stay still, don't give them a reason. But Ridge wasn't the kind of man who needed a reason. "You know why I pulled you over?" Ridge asked, his voice cutting through the night like the crack of a whip. "No, sir," Snoop replied, keeping his voice low and even. Ridge circled him slowly, his boots crunching against loose gravel. "You were speeding. 45 in a 35. Snoop resisted the urge to turn his head. He knew for a fact the limit was 40, but he also knew that arguing would only escalate things. "My bad, officer," he said. "I didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" Ridge's tone sharpened, laced with disbelief. "Man, You're sitting in a car that probably costs more than my damn house, and you didn't realize? You expect me to buy that?" Snoop clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Ridge stepped closer. "What's in the trunk?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Snoop's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to breathe. "Supplies," he said. "I'm taking them to a shelter downtown." Ridge tilted his head, his lips twisting into something that barely resembled a smile. "That so? Supplies? You sure it's not something else? Maybe a little stash you were hoping I wouldn't find?" Snoop's hands flexed against the hood of the car. He knew the game Ridge was playing, baiting him, pushing him to snap. "No, sir," he said. "Then you won't mind if I take a look." Snoop turned his head slightly, meeting Ridge's eyes for the first time. "I've got papers for the shipment," he said. "You can check them." Ridge's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I'll check 'em. But first, you and me, we're going to take this nice and slow. Hands where I can see 'em." Snoop stepped back, raising his hands as Ridge gestured toward the trunk. The officer moved with deliberate slowness, like he was savoring the moment. He patted Snoop down again, rougher this time, and ran his hands along the seams of his jacket, as if expecting something to fall out. "You smell like weed," Ridge said suddenly. Snoop blinked. "No, I don't." Ridge smirked. "Nah, you sure? Because I've been doing this long enough to know that smell anywhere. I don't smoke when I'm driving." "Oh, so you admit you smoke?" Snoop's fist tightened. "Not tonight," he said through gritted teeth. Ridge chuckled and stepped back. "Let's take a look then." Snoop watched as Ridge moved to the trunk, fishing out his keys. The officer paused, glancing back at him. "You said this is for a shelter?" "Yes, sir." "Funny," Ridge said, shaking his head. "I didn't know shelters were handing out gold chains and custom kicks." Snoop's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. The trunk popped open with a soft click. Ridge stepped back, shining his flashlight into the cargo space. The boxes were stacked neatly, each one labeled with the name of the charity, Hope Forward Relief Center. Ridge let out a low whistle. "Well, would you look at that?" He reached in and pulled out one of the boxes, setting it down on the pavement. "Hope Forward, huh?" "Yes, sir," Snoop said again. "It's all documented." Ridge flipped the box open. Medical supplies, bandages, antiseptics, and basic over-the-counter medicines filled the space. Ridge rummaged through it, scattering items like they were nothing more than trash. "You expect me to believe this isn't a cover?" Ridge said, holding up a sealed package of syringes. "Because I'll tell you what this looks like." Snoop's stomach twisted. "It's exactly what it says it is." Ridge stood up, towering over him. "You're real confident for someone in cuffs," he said, though Snoop wasn't restrained. Yet. Before Snoop could respond, Ridge's radio crackled. Another unit was approaching. "Stay right there," Ridge ordered, stepping aside to answer the call. Snoop exhaled sharply, his muscles trembling from the effort of holding back the fire that burned in his chest. He glanced around, looking for witnesses, but the street was still empty. No, not entirely. Across the street, a figure was standing on the sidewalk, a young man holding up his phone, its screen glowing faintly. Snoop's eyes locked onto him, silently urging him to keep recording. Ridge noticed too. "Hey!" he barked, striding toward the young man. "Put that down." The young man didn't move. "I said, put that down." Ridge's voice rose. Snoop's heart pounded as he watched Ridge close the distance, his hand reaching for the phone. And just like that, the situation shifted. The focus was no longer on Snoop. It was on the camera, on the eyes watching from behind the lens. But Snoop knew it wouldn't last. This was far from over. Snoop stood rigid against the cold metal of the Escalade, his hands spread flat on the hood. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cool night air. The street remained eerily quiet, except for the steady hum of the patrol car's engine and the crunch of Ridge's boots on the gravel. The officer was taking his time. Snoop had seen this act before. He wasn't just being detained. He was being made into a spectacle. Ridge's slow, deliberate movements weren't about procedure. They were about control, about reminding Snoop who held the power in this situation. And Snoop hated how familiar it felt. "Stay right there," Ridge barked, circling back toward him. Snoop's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move. He knew better. "You got a record, don't you?" Ridge said, standing close enough now that Snoop could smell the faint bitterness of coffee on his breath. "Check the paperwork," Snoop replied, his voice low and controlled. "Oh, I will," Ridge said, "but let me guess. Couple of priors? Drug possession? DUI? Snoop didn't answer. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Ridge leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Or you just don't want to admit you're still the same punk you were before you bought this fancy car?" Snoop's jaw clenched. He knew Ridge was pushing him, testing to see if he'd crack. "I told you," Snoop said evenly. "I'm taking supplies to a shelter." "And I told you," Ridge snapped, stepping back and folding his arms, "that I don't give a damn what story you're spinning. We're doing this my way." Ridge nodded toward the trunk where the boxes were still half open from his earlier search. "Empty them out." Snoop turned his head, meeting Ridge's eyes for the first time since the stop. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Take everything out of the trunk. Put it on the ground. Now." The muscles in Snoop's arms tensed, but he didn't argue. He could feel Ridge watching him, daring him to resist. Moving slowly, Snoop walked to the back of the Escalade and started unloading the boxes. His hands shook slightly as he set each one down. Ridge hovered nearby, flashlight beam dancing over the contents. Bandages, canned food, bottled water, solar-powered chargers. All of it perfectly legal. All of it necessary. But Ridge didn't care. "What's in this one?" Ridge asked, tapping his boot against one of the heavier boxes. "Generators," Snoop said. Ridge smirked. "You're really going all out for this charity thing, huh?" Snoop didn't answer. He crouched down to lift another box, but Ridge stepped closer, his shadow falling over him. "Not so fast." Snoop froze. "Stand up," Ridge ordered. Snoop straightened, and Ridge immediately reached out, patting him down again. It wasn't a search, it was a show. Ridge's hands lingered too long, pressing against Snoop's shoulders and ribs, then moving lower. He was slow, methodical, pushing the boundaries of what was necessary. Snoop bit down on the inside of his cheek, forcing himself to stay silent. "You nervous?" Ridge asked as he stepped back, his smirk widening. "No, sir." "You sure about that?" Ridge flicked his flashlight toward Snoop's feet. "Because you're shaking." Snoop inhaled deeply through his nose, willing his body to stay still. Ridge leaned in closer. "People like you," he said, his voice a low growl, "you think you can buy your way out of anything. Money, cars, fame. It don't mean a damn thing out here." Snoop met Ridge's eyes, his own steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "You done yet?" Ridge's smile disappeared. "Not even close." The officer turned and kicked one of the boxes, knocking it over. Bottled water spilled out, rolling across the pavement. Snoop flinched. "Pick it up," Ridge said. Snoop didn't move. "Pick it up." Grinding his teeth, Snoop crouched down and started gathering the bottles. His fingers trembled as he shoved them back into the box, but Ridge wasn't satisfied. "What about this?" Ridge kicked another box, this one filled with medical supplies. Packages of bandages and antiseptic wipes scattered across the ground. Snoop stood slowly, his fists tightening. "Why are you doing this?" Ridge stepped closer, his smile returning. "Because I can." Snoop's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel his control slipping, feel the rage building with every word Ridge spoke. But he also knew the truth. One wrong move, and this wouldn't end with scattered boxes. It would end with handcuffs, or worse. And that's exactly what Ridge wanted. So Snoop swallowed the anger. He bent down and started picking up the supplies. The street remained quiet, but Snoop could feel eyes watching him. When he glanced up, he saw the young man across the street still holding his phone, the camera pointed directly at them. Ridge noticed too. "Put that damn thing down," Ridge shouted, stepping away from Snoop. The young man didn't move. "I said, put it down." Ridge took a step toward him, but Snoop spoke up before he could go any farther. "Leave him alone." Ridge froze, turning back toward Snoop. "What did you just say?" "I said, leave him alone." For the first time, Ridge hesitated. "You think you're in charge here?" Ridge asked, his voice quieter but no less dangerous. "No," Snoop said, standing taller, "but I know what this looks like, and so does everyone watching." Ridge's eyes flicked toward the phone, then back to Snoop. For the first time since the stop, Ridge looked unsure. But the moment didn't last. The crackle of a radio broke the tension. Another patrol car was approaching. Ridge stepped back, his jaw tight. "This isn't over," he said. Snoop didn't answer. He just stood there, staring Ridge down as the second cruiser pulled up and a new figure stepped out, a younger officer with a calmer demeanor. And suddenly, the balance of power shifted. But Snoop knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The sharp crackle of the radio broke the fragile silence. Snoop's heartbeat still thundered in his ears, but the arrival of the second patrol car sent a ripple of tension through the air. Ridge froze mid-step, his gaze darting between Snoop and the young man still holding his phone across the street. The faint glow of the phone screen seemed brighter now, cutting through the dim light like a beacon. Snoop could feel the weight of it, the silent power that one camera lens held in that moment. It wasn't just a recording, it was evidence, proof of Ridge's actions, of the humiliation and intimidation, and Ridge knew it. "Put that phone down," Ridge barked again, his voice louder this time, more desperate. The young man didn't move. Ridge took a step toward him, one hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. "I said, put it down." "No." The voice wasn't from the witness. It was Snoop's. Ridge spun back toward him, his face red with anger. "What did you just say?" Snoop stood straighter, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. "I said no. Leave him alone." Ridge's jaw tightened. "You don't give orders here," he growled, taking a step closer to Snoop. "You think this is some music video? Think you can talk to me like that?" "No, sir," Snoop replied, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I think this is a traffic stop, and unless you've got a warrant, you've already searched enough." The muscles in Ridge's neck tensed as if he was physically restraining himself. He looked like he wanted to pounce, but the sound of the second patrol car door opened and stopped him cold. A new figure stepped onto the scene, Officer Lawrence Harper. He was younger, his uniform crisp, and his walk lacked the predatory swagger Ridge carried. His eyes flicked quickly from Ridge to Snoop to the spilled supplies on the pavement. "What's going on here?" Harper asked, his voice even. Ridge turned sharply. "Back up," Ridge said, as if that explained everything. Suspect was speeding and refused to comply. Harper's eyes narrowed slightly. That true? Snoop didn't hesitate. No, sir. I complied. I gave him my license and registration. Told him what was in the trunk, too. Harper nodded, stepping closer to the Escalade and peering inside the open trunk. He saw the boxes, marked, labeled, stacked neatly. He knelt down and picked up a water bottle that had rolled onto the pavement, turning it in his hands before looking back at Ridge. This looks like aid supplies, Harper said. It's a cover, Ridge snapped. I haven't finished the search. Harper raised an eyebrow. You've been here long enough to finish a search. He was acting suspicious. Harper looked at Snoop, then back at Ridge. Suspicious enough for backup? Ridge stiffened. You questioning me? I'm trying to understand, Harper said carefully. He turned to Snoop. Sir, may I take a look at the paperwork for this shipment? Snoop nodded and reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and handed over the documents. Harper flipped through them, his expression neutral. These check out, he said after a moment. Everything matches. Ridge's face reddened. Come on, Harper. You're just going to take his word for it? I'm taking the paperwork's word for it. Harper turned toward Snoop. Sir, you're free to go once you reload your supplies. Sorry for the inconvenience. Snoop felt the tension in his shoulders release ever so slightly. But Ridge wasn't done. You're just going to let him walk? Ridge barked, stepping closer to Harper. Harper didn't flinch. I don't see any reason to hold him. Ridge's eyes darted back to Snoop, burning with frustration. You're making a mistake, Ridge said, his voice low but venomous. No, Ridge, Harper replied. You already made one. For the first time that night, Ridge looked uncertain. His confidence wavered, his shoulders sagging just slightly. But the moment didn't last long. He straightened up and stepped back, his glare still locked on Snoop. This isn't over, Ridge muttered before turning toward his cruiser. Snoop exhaled slowly as Ridge stalked away. But his relief was short-lived. The young man across the street was still filming, and Snoop knew the video would spread like wildfire. He bent down and started picking up the scattered supplies, his hands steadying now that the immediate danger had passed. Harper crouched beside him, helping gather the bottles and packages. Sorry about that, Harper said quietly. Snoop looked up, studying him. Not your fault, Snoop replied. Harper glanced toward Ridge's cruiser. It kind of is. Snoop didn't respond. He didn't know what to say to that. Not yet. By the time the supplies were back in the trunk, Ridge's car was gone. But the unease lingered. Drive safe, Harper said as Snoop climbed back into the Escalade. You too, Snoop replied. He didn't look back as he pulled away, but the glow of the young man's phone screen stayed burned in his memory. The camera hadn't stopped recording, and Snoop knew this story was far from finished. The Escalade sat idling on the curb, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Snoop Dogg leaned against the hood, the tension in his muscles refusing to ease even as the younger officer, Lawrence Harper, took charge of the situation. The night air felt heavy, thick with the residue of Ridge's hostility, and even though Ridge had retreated to his cruiser, his presence lingered like smoke. Harper crouched down beside the spilled supplies, picking up a few stray bottles and stacking them carefully back into one of the boxes. He handled the items with a gentleness that felt alien after Ridge's rough treatment. Let's start from the beginning, Harper said, standing and facing Snoop. You said this is a delivery for a shelter? Snoop nodded, his voice steady but edged with exhaustion. Yeah. Hope Forward Relief Center. They're short on supplies after the flooding. Harper gestured toward the boxes. And this is all for them? That's right, Snoop said, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and handing it over. Inventory list, receipts, and the contact info for the shelter director if you need it. Harper took the documents and stepped toward his patrol car, flipping through the pages in the light from the cruiser's overhead lamp. Snoop watched him carefully. He couldn't afford for this to drag out any longer. Every wasted minute was another minute those supplies weren't where they needed to be. Behind him, Ridge slammed his door and stepped out of his cruiser again. You done yet? Ridge called out, his voice sharp and loaded with contempt. Harper didn't even look up. Give me a minute, he said calmly, his tone making it clear he wasn't taking orders from Ridge. Snoop's eyes flicked between the two officers. Ridge stood stiffly by his car, arms crossed, his mouth set in a tight line. The man looked ready to pounce the moment Harper gave him the slightest opening, but Harper didn't. Instead, he turned back to Snoop, holding up the papers. Everything checks out here, Harper said. Snoop exhaled, but the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. Not yet. However, Harper continued, speedin' is still speedin', and running a red light, if that's what happened, isn't something we can ignore. Snoop's jaw tensed. I wasn't trying to run anything, he said carefully. I was trying to get these supplies where they're needed. I told Ridge that, but he didn't care. Harper nodded slowly, closing the folder and tucking it under his arm. Look, I get it, he said. You're trying to do something good. I respect that. But when we see someone speeding through a residential area, we don't know the reason. All we see is a car that could hurt someone. Snoop opened his mouth to respond, but Harper held up a hand. I'm not saying Ridge was right. I saw the way he handled this, and I'm not going to defend it. But I also can't let you off without at least acknowledging the traffic violations. Snoop's frustration simmered just beneath the surface. So what now? Harper hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. I'm issuing a warning, he said. No ticket, no fine. But this gets logged. Snoop couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped his throat. You serious? After all that, you're giving me a warning? Harper's expression softened, but he didn't back down. It's better than what Ridge wanted to do. Snoop's fists clenched, but he bit back the words on the tip of his tongue. He knew Harper was right. Ridge hadn't wanted to give him a warning. Ridge had wanted to see him in handcuffs or worse. Harper handed him the slip of paper, and Snoop took it without looking at it. Look, Harper said, lowering his voice, I can't fix what just happened, but I can make sure it doesn't get any worse. Snoop's eyes narrowed. And Ridge? Harper glanced over his shoulder where Ridge was still lingering near his car, pretending not to eavesdrop. I'll handle him, Harper said quietly. Snoop studied Harper's face, looking for cracks in the man's calm, professional demeanor. He didn't see any. You trust him? Snoop asked, nodding toward Ridge. Harper shook his head. Not even a little. For the first time that night, Snoop felt something resembling relief. Harper stepped back, gesturing toward the open trunk. Let's get this loaded back up. Together, they worked quickly, repacking the supplies and securing the boxes in the trunk. Ridge didn't move. He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. When the last box was in place, Harper closed the trunk and stepped back. You're good to go, he said. Snoop hesitated. You sure? Or is Ridge going to find another excuse to stop me 2 blocks from here? Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. I'll radio ahead. Make sure you're clear. Snoop nodded. Thanks. Harper offered a small, tight smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Be safe out there. Snoop climbed back into the Escalade, his hands still trembling slightly as they gripped the wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Ridge still standing by his cruiser, his face partially hidden by shadows. As Snoop pulled away, the young man with the phone stepped closer to the curb, the screen still glowing. Snoop caught his eye for just a moment before the kid raised his fist in a silent gesture of solidarity. But as the city lights blurred past the windows, Snoop couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The engine of the Escalade hummed softly as Snoop sat behind the wheel, gripping the leather steering wheel tighter than he realized. The dim glow of the streetlights stretched long shadows across the cracked pavement, but his focus wasn't on the road ahead. It was on the moment that had just passed, and the one that was still unfolding. He had left the scene, but the tension sat heavy in his chest, refusing to let go. The glow of the young man's phone screen still lingered in his mind, reminding him that eyes had been watching, witnessing. But how much had they seen, and how much had been missed? As the Escalade rolled slowly toward the next stoplight, his phone buzzed against the console. He didn't need to check to know it was Marcus. Snoop let out a breath and answered. You good? Marcus's voice came through, sharp and urgent. I'm moving, Snoop said, his voice tight. What the hell happened, man? You were supposed to call when you dropped off the supplies. I've been blowing up your phone. Snoop's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. Got pulled over. What? Marcus's voice spiked. For what? For being me, Snoop said flatly. The line went silent for a moment. Shit, Marcus finally said. You okay? Snoop glanced in the rearview mirror. Ridge's patrol car was nowhere in sight, but the uneasy weight in Snoop's chest hadn't lifted. I'm good, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Man, you better be. You know this can't turn into a story, not now. It already is, Snoop muttered under his breath. What? Nothing, Snoop said quickly. Look, I'll call you when I drop this off. He hung up before Marcus could press further. The next intersection came into view, and Snoop slowed as the light flicked from green to yellow. He felt his pulse spike again, muscle memory from moments like this one. Even with no patrol car in sight, the fear stayed. He eased the Escalade to a stop, resting his hands lightly on the wheel. And then he heard it. A soft thump from the back of the car. Snoop froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like something shifting in the trunk. His first thought was the supplies. Maybe one of the boxes had tipped over. But then came another noise, a faint shuffling, almost like movement. A chill prickled down his spine. Slowly, he turned in his seat, glancing back toward the rear compartment. The tinted windows revealed nothing but shadows, and the silence that followed only made the noise feel louder in his memory. It's nothing, he told himself. Boxes shifting, that's all. But his stomach twisted as another thought crept in. What if Ridge had planted something? The idea hit hard, sending his mind racing. He'd seen it happen before. Stories of routine stops turned into setups. Drugs planted, guns hidden. One moment of panic, and suddenly you were on the news in cuffs with no way to prove it wasn't yours. His fingers twitched, itching to pull over and check the trunk. But then another thought cut through the noise. What if it was something worse? He swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears as he replayed Ridge's words. The smirk, the slow, deliberate search, the way he'd lingered near the trunk longer than necessary. Snoop flicked on his hazard lights and eased the car to the side of the road. The street was quiet, lined with parked cars and darkened storefronts. No sign of Ridge, no backup patrols, but that didn't make him feel any safer. Steeling himself, Snoop stepped out of the Escalade. His boots scuffed against the pavement as he moved toward the rear of the vehicle, his breath coming faster now. The trunk loomed in front of him, its sleek black surface reflecting the flicker of the hazard lights. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys, hesitating for just a moment before pressing the button. The trunk released with a soft mechanical click. The lid lifted slowly, almost too slowly, as if the car itself was reluctant to reveal what was inside. Snoop raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadows. The boxes sat stacked neatly, just as he had left them. Relief washed over him for a brief second before the light caught something else. Movement. He froze. It came from the corner of the trunk, just behind the largest box. Something shifted, and then a faint sound, almost like a whimper. Snoop's stomach dropped. He stepped closer, angling the flashlight toward the corner, and that's when he saw it. A dog. Small, scruffy, and trembling in a carrier tucked between the boxes. Its wide, nervous eyes reflected the light, and it let out another soft whimper as if sensing his fear. "What the hell?" Snoop whispered. He crouched down, shining the light more carefully now. The carrier was secured, but the dog looked scared, too scared for it to have been there intentionally. His mind raced, trying to piece it together. Ridge hadn't planted it. He couldn't have, not with Harper there. Then it hit him. It must have climbed in while he was loading supplies earlier that day. Maybe it had been left outside the shelter. Maybe it had been looking for food or warmth. Snoop let out a shaky breath and reached for the carrier. The dog flinched at first, but when he spoke softly, its trembling eased. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're okay." He set the carrier on the ground and opened the latch slowly. The dog hesitated, sniffing the air before inching forward and pressing its head against Snoop's hand. The tension that had been sitting in his chest finally started to lift. Snoop smiled despite himself. "Guess you're coming with me," he said quietly. The relief didn't last long, though. As he picked up the carrier and set it gently in the back seat, he couldn't shake the thought that Ridge's actions had planted something else inside him. Doubt. Even with the supplies intact, even with the dog accounted for, he knew this wasn't over. And as he climbed back into the driver's seat and pulled back onto the road, the headlights of a car appeared in the rearview mirror. He couldn't tell if it was Ridge or just a coincidence, but he didn't stop to find out. Snoop Dogg sat in the driver's seat of his Escalade, gripping the wheel as the headlights of the car behind him glowed menacingly in the rearview mirror. His heart thudded hard against his ribcage, each beat echoing the events of the night. The trembling dog in the carrier on the back seat whimpered softly, breaking the silence. The car behind him didn't flash its lights or sound a siren, but its presence loomed. Snoop's knuckles whitened as he clenched the steering wheel, the weight of paranoia pressing down on him. Was it Ridge? Was it backup? Or was it just some random car whose driver had no idea how much fear its proximity was causing? He took a sharp turn at the next intersection, his pulse quickening as the headlights followed. "Come on," he muttered, pressing the gas just a little harder. The Escalade's engine growled, and the distance between him and the car stretched slightly, but it was still there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the car behind him slowed, then turned down another street. Snoop exhaled, but the relief didn't erase the adrenaline still pulsing through his veins. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Marcus would have to wait. He wasn't ready to relive what had just happened. Not when the smell of Ridge's cologne and the sting of his words still lingered. Instead, he focused on the road ahead. The shelter wasn't far now. He could already picture the faces of the people waiting for the supplies. Tired, hopeful faces that didn't know what he'd just endured to get there. But as he pulled into the lot, the flashing blue and red lights hit him again. Not now. A different patrol car sat parked near the shelter entrance, its lights pulsing faintly. A crowd had already started to gather outside, their voices hushed but sharp with curiosity and unease. Snoop's stomach dropped. He parked and stepped out slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He couldn't take another confrontation tonight. Not here. A woman in a worn jacket approached. Camille, the shelter director. "Snoop," she called out, relief clear in her voice as she recognized him. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing the patrol car. She nodded quickly, but glanced nervously toward the officers talking to one of the volunteers. "They've been here since the power went out," she said. "They wanted to know if we had any supplies, like they didn't believe us when we said we didn't." Snoop felt his jaw tighten. "Did they search the place?" "Almost," Camille said, "but then they backed off. Didn't find what they were looking for, I guess." Snoop looked back at the patrol car. The officers weren't Ridge, but their presence made his skin crawl all the same. He opened the trunk and started unloading the supplies, his hands moving quickly as volunteers swarmed around to help. Camille's eyes widened when she saw the boxes. "You really came through," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. Snoop forced a smile. "Always." The tension began to ease as the boxes were carried inside and the volunteers murmured their thanks. The dog in the carrier let out another whimper, and Camille crouched down to take a look. "Who's this little guy?" Snoop shrugged. "Found him in the trunk. Guess he's a part of the delivery." Camille smiled and reached out to pet the dog through the bars of the carrier. "Well, you saved more than supplies tonight." Her words should have felt good, but they didn't. Not completely. Because Snoop knew this wasn't over. His phone buzzed again. He finally checked the screen. Marcus. But it wasn't a call. It was a link. Video uploaded. Snoop Dogg pulled over by police. What really happened? Snoop's stomach turned. He clicked the link. The video started with him leaning against the hood of the Escalade, Ridge's voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Empty the trunk." Snoop's jaw tightened as he watched himself comply, his movements slow, deliberate, controlled. The camera shook slightly, but the audio was clear. Ridge's voice rang out again and again, sharp, demanding, taunting. The part where Ridge accused him of smelling like weed made Snoop's blood boil all over again. Then came the worst part. The shove, the spilled supplies, and the close-up of Ridge's smirk. The video ended abruptly, but the damage was already done. Snoop checked the view count. Already climbing, thousands, no, tens of thousands of views. The comments flooded in. "This is what it's like to be black in America. Power trip. Fire that cop. Imagine treating someone like this, even when they're trying to help people. And y'all wonder why we don't trust the police." But not all the comments were supportive. Maybe he shouldn't have been speeding. Another celebrity playing the victim. He's probably guilty of something. They always are. Snoop felt his fingers tighten around the phone. Camille noticed his expression. "You okay?" He nodded, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Yeah, just tired." But that wasn't true. He wasn't tired. He was angry. Because the video, as damning as it was, wouldn't fix what had happened. Ridge wouldn't face consequences, not real ones. Snoop knew how these things went. A slap on the wrist, maybe a transfer, and Ridge would be back on the streets ready to do it all over again. Snoop looked at the volunteers, at the shelter, at the dog trembling in the carrier. He had done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. The supplies were inside. The people had what they needed, but the fire burning in Snoop's chest wouldn't go out. Because even with the proof, even with the witnesses, even with the eyes of the world watching, justice still felt out of reach. And Snoop wasn't sure it would ever feel close enough. The night pressed down hard, heavy, and unrelenting as Snoop Dogg sat alone in his dimly lit living room. The glow of his television cast flickering shadows against the walls, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were fixed on his phone where the video of his traffic stop had exploded across the internet. He scrolled through the comments again, even though each one felt like reopening a wound. Some were supportive, loud voices demanding accountability, pushing for Ridge's suspension or firing. Others, though, were venomous. Doubters, critics, racists hiding behind anonymous profiles, twisting the narrative, calling him entitled, a thug, an opportunist. His thumb hovered over the screen before he set the phone down with more force than necessary. The dog he had rescued, the same scruffy little thing he'd found trembling in the trunk, curled up at his feet. It had calmed down after Camille fed it earlier, but it still wouldn't leave his side, as if it knew something wasn't right. Snoop reached down and stroked the dog's fur absently, his thoughts drifting back to the moment Ridge had told him to empty the trunk. The humiliation, the powerlessness, it stuck with him, deeper than he wanted to admit. His mind replayed Ridge's smirk, the condescension in his voice, the casual way he had treated him like less than a man. Snoop had been called many things in his life: rapper, icon, legend. But in that moment, Ridge hadn't seen any of it. He hadn't seen a man trying to deliver supplies to people in need. He hadn't seen someone who had built himself up from nothing. He'd seen a black man in a nice car. And that had been enough. The TV crackled, pulling Snoop's attention back to the screen. The news anchor's voice filled the room, sharp and polished. In a video that has now gone viral, rapper and entrepreneur Snoop Dogg was stopped by police last night during what appears to have been a routine traffic stop. The officer in question, identified as Brian Ridge, is facing growing backlash over accusations of racial profiling and abuse of power. Protesters have already gathered outside the precinct calling for his immediate suspension pending investigation. Snoop leaned back into the couch, the dog shifting slightly against his leg. The footage they were showing on the news was the same clip that had been posted online. The shaky camera, the spilled supplies, Ridge's face caught in an ugly moment of triumph. It played on repeat as the anchor recapped the events in clinical detail, but watching it on the news didn't make him feel any better. The reporters talked about accountability. They talked about police reform. They talked about Ridge's history, several complaints, all dismissed. They talked about the protests forming outside the station. What they didn't talk about was the fear. They didn't talk about what it felt like to stand there, hands against the hood of the car, wondering if this was the night it all went wrong. They didn't talk about the humiliation, the way Ridge's hands had lingered, the way he'd kick the boxes just to see Snoop clean up the mess. They didn't talk about the anger. The heat that had burned in Snoop's chest since that first flash of red and blue lights. The anger hadn't faded. It had settled. Snoop turned the TV off and sat in the silence that followed. He could still hear the hum of the Escalade's engine in his ears, still feel the weight of Ridge's stare. The dog shifted again, pressing its head against his leg. Snoop looked down at it, its wide, trusting eyes reflecting the dim light. "You don't get it," he said softly. "You don't know what it's like." The dog wagged its tail. Snoop let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Maybe that's better." His phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another news outlet picking up the story. He didn't bother to look. Instead, he stood, the dog hopping to its feet beside him. He crossed the room and looked out the window, the quiet streets stretching out before him. He knew the protests would grow. The media would keep pushing the story for a while. Ridge might get suspended, maybe even fired. But then the cameras would move on, the protests would fade, and Ridge, or someone just like him, would be back on the streets pulling over someone else. And Snoop knew it wouldn't matter how famous that person was. It wouldn't matter if they were on their way to help people or just heading home from work. The red and blue lights wouldn't see any of that. They'd see what Ridge had seen, and that was the part that kept Snoop awake. He turned away from the window and looked down at the dog. "You hungry?" The dog wagged its tail again, and Snoop forced a smile. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." As he moved toward the kitchen, he knew the night wasn't over. Not really. The video would keep spreading. The conversations would keep happening. But the weight in his chest wasn't something that would go away with trending hashtags or headlines. It would stay, because it always stayed. And the next time those red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, he knew the fear would come right back. He just hoped he'd be ready. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave comments. We want to know what you think. Watch other videos on the channel for more exciting stories.